Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa. It's great to see you. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka with Peter Bale, co-host of the Hoon, beaming in from his location in London. How's it going, Peter?
Secret location in London. I'm good, thank you, Bernard. How about you? It's good. I was thinking actually. You said we take the temperature around the world. So I've come out to the world to see what's here.
Yeah, and it looks sort of spring-like, and things are growing in the background.
Things are growing very fast, and hopefully we might see Tibbles or Marmaduke, the foxes that were around. They may not be exactly the foxes that were around last year, but I can tell you what, listening to foxes making love during the night, there'll be plenty of fresh foxes around very soon. And of course, I immediately thought of George Clooney and got George Clooney playing Fantastic Mr. Fox in the Wes Anderson version. They're out there making love rather seductively and squawkily, and hopefully Tibbles and Marmaduke will come past.
And if we're really lucky, it'll happen in the background for those regular
That's right.
Listeners and watchers of the Hoon. You might recall a year or so ago, while we were doing doing a very similar thing, a fox turned up in the background, which was it didn't quite go viral in the way I was hoping for, but certainly was entertaining. And if we're lucky,
and of course it allowed me to refer to the famous Norwegian song "What the Fox Say."
What the Fox Say, exactly.
Yes, exactly.
So this is the What the Fox episode of the Hoon here this week. Thank you for those who are patient.
And we have a silver fox going to be on the show, don't we? Or at least we're going to talk about the parliamentary silver fox on the show, Winston Peters.
Yes, indeed. And there's going to be quite a few people with grey hair on the show, including me. Whether I'm a silver fox depends on...
I don't think a certain person who lives in your house quite likes the idea of you being... I mean, if you are a silver fox, then you're most definitely only a silver fox for that person, not
absolutely
for general consumption, as it were.
No, for general consumption, no. It has been quite a week in politics. Things are really kicking off here. And we've had a bunch of polls showing what I suggested in recent weeks, which was there's been a collapse in support for the government and for the government's direction on the economy in the last 2 to 3 months.
Has there actually, though, Bernard? Or are you being a bit too Mikey Sherman about this? I've seen the fuss that's going on there about that.
Mikey is absolutely right. I'm cheering for Mikey every night, because I could see it coming in the numbers on right track, wrong track, on consumer confidence, and it's evident in 3 polls.
Oh, I see.
This week.
Good. Yes, you have been saying that about right track, wrong track. That's right.
And not only did we get the One News Varian poll, which Mikey talked about in quite sensational terms, and rightly, I think. But also we got leaked versions of the Talbot Mills poll, the internal polling for Labour, which showed Labour and the Greens and Te Pāti Māori ahead of National as well. And also Roy Morgan. Now that it didn't show Labour, the Greens and Te Pāti Māori ahead of National Act in New Zealand First in that poll, but it did show the gap narrowing from 15.5 percentage points to 10. The real difference, of course, the One News poll showed New Zealand First dipping under 5%, which completely changes the complexion of everything, and shows that the government, shock horror, when it does unpopular things, becomes unpopular. And
is it unpopular, Bernard? Because I've been watching overnight that David Seymour has been pointing out the percentage supporting the government cuts and supporting the beheading of all bureaucrats. I mean, we often talk about the media in this, and I'm sure we'll talk about politics more when you get to Craig Rennie in this. But is there anything in what the government is saying that the state broadcaster is being sensationalist? Or are they just trying to
Well,
nobble
I think they're
the
not
new
happy with
TVNZ
the
political editor?
Yeah, they're certainly not happy with the way that the poll has been portrayed. But I think that just betrays themselves as not happy with the
Mm-hmm.
poll itself,
Mm,
because this
mm,
poll is consistent with what we're seeing in various other measures, and it's totally understandable. You've got a
mm,
government which promised to get the economy back on track, to get things fired up again, to get the economy going. Instead, they froze decisions on spending. They've embarked on pretty massive cuts in the public sector. They've scared the bejesus out of
mm,
consumers, investors. And as I reported this week, the construction sector, both horizontal infrastructure and commercial and residential construction, has ground to a halt because the government
mm,
said we're not going to give any of our money to councils to help out with their water infrastructure. We're not going to spend money on Kāinga Ora. And
mm.
shock horror, stuff has stopped. And so we're now in not only a technical
Despite all
recession.
of the tax assistance, despite all
Yeah,
of the tax assistance that suggests that housing is the thing.
actually, I mean, you can see this in the survey results back through Tony Alexander earlier in the week from Rental Property Investors, which is the only
Mm-hmm.
really good survey of how rental property investors think and what they're doing. It shows that the level of interest from rental property investors in either buying brand new houses or helping to develop new houses at a record low,
Mm-hmm.
despite the fact they've just gotten their interest deductibility back. And also,
Which is an
sadly for
extraordinary
the
decision. I mean, I expected that to really trigger an almost immediate investment in housing.
Yeah, but the problem is there's a whole bunch of rental property investors who are economically rational looking around and seeing that people aren't spending their money, other
Mm.
businesses aren't investing. And why? Because there's so much uncertainty about what's happening in the economy, what the government's doing. Now, in theory, we'll find out a lot more on May the 30th when the government comes up with its
Yes.
budget. But we know already that they're not going to use the government's balance sheet to solve these capital shortages at both a national level and at a local level with councils. Councils right now are rolling out double-digit rates increases because they don't have any money left because the government won't share it. Just today, Nicola Willis said talk to the hand to Wayne Brown on rates rebates on GST to councils. And we're also seeing, various fees and charges going up from the government. So, for example, yesterday, we saw public transport bus fares and train fares for
Mm.
teenagers
Mm.
jump. We saw this
Which is one of
morning
the
from
most
Shane.
extraordinarily stupid and punitive things you could possibly imagine. I mean, it is
Exactly.
just this attack on public transport. I mean, even those kids aren't going to be taken to, not all of those kids can be taken to school in double cab utes, Bernard.
That's right. You can fit a lot in the back. That's not very safe apart from anything else.
No, that's right.
But that doesn't seem to be a problem for the government, which is getting rid of speed bumps, getting rid of speed restrictions outside of schools. And it's suddenly dawned on the government, gee, when we do things which are sociopathic and which people don't like, they don't like us. How did that happen?
I wonder if that's true, Bernard. I don't know. I've just asked everybody whether they agree with you. Nobody's answering me really yet, other than Brett Tamahori telling us they're a bunch of right-wing bastards, which is fair enough. But I wonder, and I've been thinking this for some time. We used to talk, and when it was the Labor government period, about the government borrowing, in fact, being perfectly reasonable within OECD comparisons and so on. There's a genuine talking down of the economy. This whole, we've inherited a bloody mess, is not really working. They're talking the economy down, aren't they? Isn't there there's a sentiment problem here that they're pro-growth, which I am, and pro some extraordinary right-wing libertarian measures, which of course I occasionally dabble in, but they're really talking the economy down.
Yeah, it's like macroeconomics 101. It's like they haven't really understood the effect of not only the stabilizer effects that government can have, but also the spiral effects you get when you change your view on the economy. Just go back to the master himself, John Maynard Keynes, who talked about the economy's animal spirits. These are the the moods, the murmurations, if you like, of investors and
Oh,
consumers
the
who,
murmurations.
oh,
Jesus Christ, there's a
dear.
vocabulary off going on here.
That's
Yeah,
that's that's right. No, I
yeah.
inhaled a thesaurus earlier, and when you talk down the economy, when you say the budget's in a mess, we've been closed to the world, we are useless at productivity.
Mm,
Everyone goes, gee, the people in charge thinks we're useless and that we're in trouble.
exactly.
I know what I'll do. I'll stop spending.
Yeah, or I'll move to Australia. Speaking of typhoons and animal spirits, there's Catherine.
Hello.
And nature is healing. We were talking, Catherine, earlier about the very active foxes in the background of Peter's location
Ah, yes.
in suburban London. And what's extraordinary, I find, about nature is healing and the rebirth, almost despite what humans are doing, of many places. And we're seeing this, in Aotearoa, Wellington, for example, the extraordinary growth of bird life. And it's the reason the kaka is called
Even
the kaka,
Kaka. Exactly.
because the kaka spilled over from the Zealandia Nature Reserve into the rest of Wellington. There was from the ground up movement to get rid of pests as much as possible, and suddenly our suburbs are springing back to life. It is fantastic.
Whereas here we feed our cats feed our cats to the foxes, and in fact also just behind me is an extraordinary. They're probably not out now because it's raining, but there is a fantastic collection of parakeets that live in this area because it's near the heath. And I was on Twitter the other day and noticed that somebody was disabusing one of the great urban myths about the London parakeets, which is that they were originated with a pair that escaped from the filming of The African Queen with Humphrey Bogart from Pinewood Studios, and I'm afraid that apparently is a myth, and they're just
That's a
escapees
pity.
from somebody's house. Exactly, but I
Still,
love the idea that this, there's a vast quantity of these little buggers there eating about a kilo of bird food a day.
well, what we need to do, Peter, is in your next trip up to London, you just throw a couple of kaka in your overhead luggage,
That's a very good
sneak
idea.
sneak it through customs because the British customs don't care about that stuff, and repopulate the
That's a
hell
very
out
good
of
idea.
London with kaka.
Like Bernard,
I'm
Bernard,
literally telling sites on you.
I'd need something a little bit bigger than a pair of budgie smugglers, but that, of course, would suit me, as you know. Carcass smugglers would be more like sort of Eighth Army ships.
Kaka smugglers. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, this is fantastic.
I'm really
Kaka
struggling
smuggling.
with the imagery.
Yeah. No, good stuff. Catherine, lovely to have you on. Thank you very much. And thank you again for your weekly climate news wrap, which we've gotten out today for those regular subscribers. And for free subscribers, it's available for everyone. And we thank paying subscribers for their support in producing that. Catherine, this week, one of the big pieces of news has come out of the US Congress, where a Senate committee has been delving around into the internal communications of the big oil companies and has found some new stuff. We knew they were up to no good, but tell us more.
Oh, it's getting really interesting. So this is an investigation that started in a house in the lower house, but when the Democrats were in charge, and then it sort of went quiet for a while after the Republicans kind of took charge of that, and now a Senate Budget Committee has picked it up and started to run with it. And so what they've done is they've written a report based on all of the information that they got that was subpoenaed earlier from big oil companies and from the American Chamber of Commerce and from the Petroleum Institute. And they've written a report about this, and they're running some, they've got, they're sitting today. They've got a hearing running on it at the moment. And even what's coming out of the hearing today has been really interesting. I think for my money, the stuff that's the most interesting and the most consequential is where they're talking about the links between academic institutions and oil companies and the amount of money that's been going in to pay for particular research. And what this is spreading light on is research to promote the growth and use of gas, particularly as a bridging fuel, but also more recently, a lot of the research that's been going on into carbon capture and storage. And so some of what the conversations, for instance, what's come out today during the hearings, there was a internal presentation at BP from 2016 and internal discussions where they were questioning the viability of carbon capture, utilization and storage at all. And I think it was Senator Chuck Grassley or somebody like that was saying that there was a pattern of the industry touting empty solutions to delay the transition. And so both of those two are now starting to be seen as, rather than potential solutions to help the transition, they're more ways to delay the transition.
Catherine,
I've been hearing a lot of stuff. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Is there anything in there, a couple of things on this, is there anything in there about this question of how individuals can be sort of compelled to feel as though they're to blame, that individual action is both fruitless? We've talked about that I think when I've talked to you about my own carbon footprint, which of course now is enormous having come over here, you've said that this is a kind of, I think that there's a sort of promotion of that idea from the oil companies of, what can one person do to save the world? Answer: nothing.
Well, actually, in the past, I think it may have been BP again. It was one of the oil majors that was actually behind the launching of this idea of calculating one's individual climate footprint in order to try to suggest that individuals were responsible for changing things rather than big corporations like oil companies. So yeah, there has been some history around that sort of thing. Yeah. So yeah, in that case, they're more.
Yeah, I should also mention that this whole thing about their internal documents originates, I think, in 2015 when Columbia University students, the very same type of students, although hopefully if they were there in 2015, they've now graduated into incredibly high-paying journalism jobs. But they broke a story in 2015 about these internal documents, which then went to the New York Times and everywhere else. So, journalism can have an impact on this, and it ends up now with this kind of investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good story. There's sort of been some stuff floating around about MIT's links to the gas industry as well that I've been picking up on LinkedIn.
That would be an incredible surprise for an
organisation
that also. That would be an incredible surprise for an organisation that also took a great deal of money from Epstein.
Yep, absolutely. And in fact, I think there's some connections there as well in terms of some research that was being done in Russia, but I can't remember the details of it. But also in these papers at the moment, institutes at Princeton and Harvard and the University of California and Stanford, like all of these elite institutions are coming out as having, having centres or research specifically funded by fossil fuel entities. And what's coming out in these papers as well is what the fossil fuel companies were hoping to achieve from that. So what sort of narratives they were hoping to have supported and
was it partly confusion, that they were seeking confusion and a sense of futility?
Well, my sense of what they were trying, they were much more focused on specific types of technology that would delay the transition. So this is promoting the use of gas in particular. And that was very successful. It went all the way to Barack Obama's regime when he was talking about fracking and gas as being, the big way forward. And like I said, carbon capture and storage. So these are things where it extends the life cycle of fossil fuels. It says that it's okay, we can keep producing them because they're part of the solution. And yeah, so that's what I've read so far is is most of where the focus has been.
And there is a something to be aware of from a journalistic point of view. Peter, you mentioned that journalism can be part of the solution here, but also it's interesting that the oil companies have been very aggressive in recent years in sponsoring content, in helping to put money into the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, some of the big sort of blue chip media with all sorts of sponsored events and various other things. And it'll be a real question for journalists and media outlets about how they deal with, requests from oil companies to, tell their story in the best possible way.
Yeah, and Catherine, we only use regime when we're talking about administrations that we don't like. So it's not the Obama regime; it's the Trump regime, the evil Trump regime.
Trump. We'll talk about that at later time.
Yeah,
Catherine, thank you so much for coming onto the show. Lovely to see you again.
All right, it's good to see you all.
Great, and it's a real privilege and a pleasure to see Robert Patman back again, our a regular expert on international affairs. Thank you, Robert. We had a bit of a holiday over Anzac Day.
Yeah.
But it's great to see you back again. We often see you so often on the news these days. It's fascinating to see geopolitics on the front pages and at the top of the bulletins of regular news, which we're certainly seeing a lot more of lately.
only because they can have the George Clooney of Otago University.
Well, yeah, no, it's good.
It's probably because we're dealing with issues which are what I call intermestic in nature. They're crossing both domestic and foreign policy, and the AUKUS controversy is one of them. And so I guess that may account for it.
Yeah, just talking on AUKUS, we had a big speech from Winston Peters, the Foreign Minister, yesterday, in which he said the government was quite a long way off a decision on joining AUKUS 2, in large part because we're not really sure what AUKUS 2 is. So what did you think of that speech and where the debate has gone to over the last few weeks?
I thought it was a bit of a mixed bag. First of all, I thought Mr. Peters was quite right to draw attention to some very worrying regional hotspots such as Gaza and the Ukraine. These are hotspots with potential escalation to the global level, so they shouldn't be taken lightly. At the same time, I thought that he repeated his claim that the international situation was the worst in living memory. Those of us who are old enough to remember the Cold War know that's simply not true. And we faced at least three periods during the three instances in the Cold War when the world teetered on the brink of a full nuclear Armageddon. And the other thing is, what he didn't mention in his speech is that many of the problems the world faces now, when I say the world, I mean all states, big and small and middle sized, can't be solved without international cooperation. So what we're really seeing internationally is a picture of both alarm, but also hope. The hope is that, like it, or dislike it, many of the problems we face now can only be fixed by international cooperation. They're too big for superpowers to fix. And I thought that element was missing from his presentation. I also regretted the fact that he said there was still no information about Pillar 2 membership, and that they were still exploring it. And that to me is not really the big issue. Whether Pillar 2 membership is acceptable to New Zealand or not doesn't depend on further information about what it contains. It depends on what, not the means of the alliance, but what its ends are. And we know what the ends are. The ends are to nominally bolster the rules-based international system against the growing assertiveness of China. And that, to me, is the crucial thing we have to keep our eye on, because irrespective of what Pillar 2 consists of, if there is sharing in cutting-edge defence technology, what will it be used for? Well, we know that it will be used to try and contain China in the Indo-Pacific. And that's what Kiwis have got to keep their eye on. As Clausewitz keeps pointed out many times, means have to serve ends. So when we keep talking about we don't know the means yet, that is actually not the major point. We do know from September 2021 that 3 English-speaking countries have set themselves up to try to contain what they see as Chinese assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific. And that's quite clear. So if we join Pillar 2 and we have access to these new technologies, that's what they will be intended to do, which is a slight complication because China happens to be our biggest trading partner.
Yeah,
But it doesn't.
I think
Well,
that,
you go, Peter.
didn't Clausewitz also memorably use the word bollocks to talk about not knowing what was on the thing when his officials had already been. We now know from FOIA work that New Zealand officials have been looking very deeply at.
Oh yes, for
at
3 years,
Tier
and we
2 for
still
a
don't
number
know
of
what
years.
Pillar 2 consists
exactly.
of.
So I think we can safely say that he's talking bollocks there, the foreign minister, not Clausewitz. But the other thing with this, I was quite struck by 2 things actually, Robert. And one, I don't want to be unfair asking you a quasi-political question, but he talked about New Zealand not in fact having a non-aligned foreign policy. And he said, we've always had alliances and we fought 2 wars with the Americans. That's setting you up very much for an alliance, a deepened alliance with the United States, which fits with what Luxon has said about staying with our allies. But it's also very interesting that just how active Helen Clark is in this whole discussion and how weighty she is. And his response to that of saying we've never had a non-aligned foreign policy, not that anyone has suggested that we have, seemed a real shot across her bows, slightly unsuccessful, but a shot across her.
Well, I think it was a straw person argument. Helen Clark's the first one to say that China's a dictatorship and a one-party state and we shouldn't have any illusions about it. And these charges of anti-Americanism are nonsense because that's an intellectual cop-out. It's a bit like if you criticise the Netanyahu government, you suddenly become anti-Semitic. America's behaviour in giving unconditional support to Israel in the Gaza situation where 34,000 Palestinians have lost their lives, many of whom had nothing to do with the events of 7th of October when Hamas attacked Israel in a terrorist attack. We have to reconcile our fact. We have to look at the full picture. The United States.
That's an interesting segue, though, Robert. You've done what I try to do sometimes, and you've segued from rather uncomfortably from AUKUS to Gaza. So just explain that, because I think this.
AUKUS is set up to uphold the international rules-based order, Peter, and unfortunately, the United States has undercut the official rationale for AUKUS by being complicit in a bonfire of international law in Gaza. And New Zealand has to take that into account. And, we've never had any illusions about China. When we signed the free trade agreement, China was less assertive and less ambitious, but it's grown in the interim. Now, the key question is, do we bind ourselves into what the government calls ever closer relations with the United States, given how the United States has behaved in Gaza during the last 6 months, and given that the volatile nature of US politics at the moment and the prospect, and it can't be dismissed, that Mr. Trump may become president in November? Would many Kiwis feel very comfortable in being part of Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which will be headed by President Trump? Many Australians wouldn't be. And I don't think a lot of Kiwis right across the political spectrum would feel ecstatic about that prospect. So these are the sort of discussions that need to come out.
Particularly when, if we do have a Donald Trump presidency, one of the first things he's promised to do is to increase the tariffs on imports from China from 35% in many cases to over 70%, which the economists I've been keeping an eye on say will further deglobalize the world, break the world up into trade blocks, and would actually make it harder for us to trade with China. We're also seeing from the United States a push towards potentially cutting China's banks out of the global financial system, in part because of their apparent involvement in moving funds back and forth into Russia to pay for Russian oil, but also to for Russian money to pay for Chinese drones. You know, if we're talking about defending free trade, defending international rules-based order, and aligning ourselves with the good guys, well, actually, the good guys are not only undermining the free trade, the rules-based order, but they're also looking to actively undermine free trade, and in particular, put us in the camp that will be further away from our main trading partner.
Yeah, I mean, that's a crucial point, Peter. AUKUS is based on the assumption that China is the major threat to the international rules-based order, whereas from your comments and from others, it's quite clear that there's multiple threats to the international rules-based order. And it's happened under Mr. Trump's watch when he was president. He was the one who took actions to undermine a crucial institution to our national interest, which is the WTO, where we've 7 times taken other countries in trade disputes there to the disputes resolution panel and won 7 times. Well, you know, and then Mr. Biden hasn't rowed back this undermining of the WTO. So we have to be very clear-eyed about this. We can't be romantic or have wishful thinking about the United States as it existed in the late 90s under Mr. Clinton. The United States in 2024 is, at the moment, a politically volatile country which has not walked the talk on the international rules-based order in the Middle East. And from our point of view, in New Zealand, there is a huge distinction between the international rules-based order on which we critically depend and what the US see as the US rules-based order. There is a big distinction, and that is something that the government is going to have to crank into its equation.
Robert, do you think that the government, and particularly Winston Peters, partly were through these tactics of going on the attack rather than discussing the issues, might be trying to in fact delay a decision until it's much clearer who will be the president of the United States after November?
It's possible, but I think, in a sense, the government and Mr. Peters went to extraordinary lengths in his speech to say they're just simply continuing a process that was begun 3 years ago under Labour, and certainly exploratory discussions were opened. But it's quite clear that this government is much more forward-leaning on the prospect of that investigation into the possibility of joining Pillar 2. They have linked AUKUS discussions with the prospect of closer alignment with the United States, which is a linkage, as far as I can see, the previous government did not make. And what we did know about the previous government, they had mixed feelings about it. The foreign minister, Nanaia Mahuta, was very cool on the idea, and I think Mr. Little made some encouraging noises about joining, but he seemed to backtrack towards the end of their time in government. So I think there is a difference. You know, but at the same time, the other thing we have to ask ourselves is, after 3 years, why haven't the previous Labour government and the new national government, despite vigorous efforts, discovered what Pillar 2 consists of?
Yeah.
Robert,
Because
let me ask
the
you about another
suspicion
thing that came up this week, because you were at that parliamentary, or the conference in Parliament that Helen Clark and Bob Carr set up to discuss these questions. And it was, of course, mainly people who are somewhat opposed to it. But we now have Bob Carr, the former Australian Foreign Minister, threatening to sue Winston Peters over things he said about Bob Carr. And I was struck by 2 things. One, it reminds me of that quote about the Falklands War being 2 bald men fighting over a comb, but also the old sort of defamation truism, which is that to defame somebody you have to have a reputation, or to feel defamed you have to have a reputation. But what do you think is going on there with Bob Carr and Peters? Without defaming either of them again, please, Robert.
No.
good luck, everyone.
I wouldn't dream of it. First of all, just to sort of explain, or try to explain, Mr. Peters' position, maybe he knows something that the rest of us don't know about Bob Carr, the former Australian Foreign Minister, or he simply engaged in loose talk. And if you're the chief diplomat for New Zealand, you shouldn't do that. And I have a feeling that this will be resolved quite soon, because I think I have a sense that Bob Carr is not bluffing about asking for a full and public and unreserved public. He's actually at the moment suing for defamation. One way it can resolve this, and Mr. Peters knows this as a lawyer or someone who had previously been a lawyer, he will have to issue an unreserved and public apology and say that he misspoke.
And
but
we'll all be...
there's quite serious implications here for trans-Tasman relations.
Yeah, Bob Carr is a serious player. You know, he may well be outside of government.
It's a very serious thing to allege as well.
Yeah,
you
and in
could
Australia,
imagine them doing the Zuckerberg Elon Musk cage fight idea, actually, because they're both quite pugilistic. I suspect, Robert, the first thing Winston's going to do is blame the media for misreporting them, isn't he?
Well, it's on tape, so I don't think there's much chance of that.
Yeah, and it will be interesting. We'll all be there for that apology when it comes. And I think Winston Peters, he is a regular user of the defamation laws in New Zealand, so he'll be very aware of the implications. And
but it's, if I was Mr. Luxon, I mean, again, to be fair, maybe both Mr. Luxon and Mr. Peters know something that is not publicly, information that's not in public circulation, and Mr. Peters felt confident about saying such a thing. But if that's not the case, this is a huge own goal.
Well, they're also, if that's the case, that he's got something he wants to tell us about Bob Carr's history, that's a decision to declare war on our partners in Australia in a political sense. Remember, it's the Labor government which is in power in federal power in Australia. Bob Carr is no sort of exile from the Labor Party in Australia. He is right in the middle of it. He is a grandee of the Labor Party in Australia, alongside Paul Keating, who I would pay money to see Paul Keating versus Winston Peters somewhere.
That's funny. Yes, when I saw this. Yeah, when I saw this tweet, the first tweet, I thought, oh my God, it's going to be Keating. And of course, unfortunately it wasn't, but he'll step straight into it.
But the other thing that puzzled me about the interview in the morning, on Morning Report, was Mr. Peters, our foreign minister's claim that Bob Carr was somehow interfering or having the temerity to comment about New Zealand's possible participation in AUKUS. Australia is part of AUKUS, and we are proposing to join something that Australia is part of. And I can't really see how our closest ally, if he's someone who lives in, happens to be living in the country of our closest ally, and he's asked the question what he thinks of AUKUS, I don't think he could say no comment with regard to New Zealand. So I find that a bit odd, really. Yeah, I mean, it's...
Yeah, it's I mean, they often refer to to the Secretary of State as America's top diplomat. So Winston, of course, we know is a pugilist, not a diplomat. But this is a very, very undiplomatic thing to have said.
Well, it's created a big problem for the government.
There's also to remember that Bob Carr is a former foreign minister of Australia, and is not some sort of off the reservation a person who is creating mayhem in Australia. He is inside the establishment. So I think they've made a political misjudgment, and also yet again Christopher Luxon is not in control or has an ability to reprimand the Deputy Prime Minister or his coalition partner and future Deputy Prime Minister David Seymour. And I think it's one of the reasons they've been hammered so hard in the polls in the last few weeks, that people have worked out that Luxon appears, if not weak, then at least inattentive when it comes to, the foreign affairs. It's not a light thing.
It was interesting, the comment that the Prime Minister gave this evening, just before I came on air, I read that he basically said that he felt that Mr. Peters was doing an exceptional job as Foreign Minister, and that Bob Carr, I think he said words to the effect, I'm sure Bob Carr will understand the rough and tumble of politics. But
yeah, well,
I think that may have been someone, he may have been advised to say that, I'm not sure Bob Carr, who's no mug when it comes to going toe to toe with people, I'm not sure he'll see it that way.
No, well, it's as we know, whenever a prime minister says he has a minister has his full support, it's when you start the clock ticking.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's
but
the
does
old,
he? That's the other thing, is that Mr. Luxon is in a very difficult position because if he did try to, I think, discipline Mr. Peters, I'm not sure Mr. Peters would necessarily rein in his activities. Would he
No,
respond to that
What
sort
do you
of?
make of? Well, I asked you before. What do you make of Helen Clark's involvement in this, or the degree to which she's possibly found the issue on which she and the Helen Clark Foundation can be more prominent? Is it a useful contribution? Is it like having one of those, those that UN group, the elders, coming in?
Look, I'm a bit of a fan of Helen Clark because she's a substantial politician. Doesn't have to agree. You don't have to agree with her in everything, but she does her homework and she's thoughtful and analytical. And the thing is, I thought she gave one of the best interviews by any politician in this country or former politician at the beginning of the Gaza crisis about how that was developing. But I also think, given her experience of making tough decisions, I know we've discussed this before, but Helen Clark showed real courage when she said no to George W. Bush over supporting the illegal US invasion of Iraq. She came under a lot of heat in this country from some of the national opposition, and not least from the US ambassador at the time, Charles Swindells, the American ambassador in Wellington at that time. Her ability to stand her ground and not support the invasion was absolutely vindicated. And I think, with regard to AUKUS, I think it's more to do, I'm not sure Helen Clark's seeking the spotlight. I think she believes it's a potentially momentous decision for this country, which would not work out in the long run to the advantage of us as a country.
Brilliant.
That's
Well, let's
right,
get her on
Robert.
next week. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank
you very much, Robert. Lovely to have you on. And
Thank you.
It's great fun, too, to have a friend of the show, Craig Rennie, back on with us on the Hoon, who is beaming in
the
from
Kaka,
Wellington. He's on the Kaka. He's in the Kaka, beaming in from Wellington, where there's been plenty of action on both the economic and the political front this week. Craig, firstly, could you give us a sense of the mood in the streets on Wellington at the moment, with all of this news of job cuts and budget coming up, and what are people saying to you when they bump into you on the terrace or on Lambton Quay?
Well, as you can see, I'm currently in Wellington Central right now, the mean streets of Burrenpore behind me. And what people are telling me is that times are tough, things are hard. Any mood of optimism with the new government has evaporated. People are asking themselves the question, what's the plan? There doesn't appear to be one. There's a real risk that we sort of fall back into a 1980s, 1990s style of let's just cut everything and worry about the consequences later. And everyone's pinning their hopes on someone pulling a rabbit from the hat at the budget later this month to sort of give people a sense of optimism, to give people a sense that actually there is something more than just an austerity agenda, and there's something more than just a series of tax cuts for people. So that's what people are telling me on the streets, is that their confidence has evaporated. Business confidence is rapidly evaporating. And when I talk to people in business, in the private sector economy, and workers in the private sector economy, they're telling me that orders have dried up. That that people are ringing up consumers and making sure they're actually going to buy things, because they're a bit worried that people are starting to roll back. We've seen, and I've certainly heard anecdotally, people paying exit clauses rather than getting into contracts because of the loss of confidence currently in the economy. So there's a real sense of worry out there.
And do you think that Chris Bishop and Nicola Willis can pull something out of the hat? Because this is the sort of great hope. There's a bunch of people out there in business saying, well, yeah, they've killed off Three Waters and they've torched the RMA and they've shut down development at Kāinga Ora and they've told NZTA to stop. but that's because they've got something coming in the budget. So what are you hearing, or what do you think that rabbit could be? Or maybe there's just no rabbit.
That's the worry, is that they'll pull a rabbit from the hat. You just may not like the results, is the honest answer.
Well, the rabbit
And
probably has myxomatosis. That is the trouble.
Yeah, well, the rabbit has seen better days, and that's the real risk, is that actually we just end up with a return to what was the situation, certainly under the Bill English, John Key government, where government essentially stops investing, government stops delivering the schools and the hospitals we need. That's a real problem, because if we go back to that, we're going back to the period where we see rapid population growth. We see a return to housing markets delivering our growth in the economy, and population delivering growth in the economy, but we don't see any real growth, and GDP per capita continues the long slide that we've seen, certainly for the past 5 quarters and over the next few quarters as well.
So Craig, may I ask you two sorry, Bernard, is it all right if I ask Craig a couple of questions?
Yep.
Craig, there's a similarity between the much criticised Adrian Orr talking the economy down and his warnings, and this rather self-inflicted negativity in the economy, don't you, from a political point of view? And second, if you could address that. And second questions, and we did this at the top of the hour, but do you have any sympathy for the idea that this is being badly reported, particularly by the public broadcaster TVNZ, or is that just blaming the messenger?
I think when you're losing the message, it's really easy to blame the messenger. And I think it's fair to say that the government has lost the message on this, and it's lost the public on this. Public confidence in the economy is down. All the polling and the business confidence data tells us that it's down, and there's a real challenge in sort of getting that back. And so I think it's really easy to then start blaming others. I know, because I've been there working for political parties where we've done exactly that. I think in terms of Adrian, the point about Adrian, if you keep telling people that the economy is not doing very well, if you keep telling people that the economy is suffering and that it's very fragile, to use the phrase of Christopher Luxon, people will start believing you, and they will start behaving accordingly. And so there's a real risk that actually we end up talking the economy into a negative spiral. In the US, in the sort of the pre-COVID period, we had a thing called the vibe session, where people were worried that actually we were about to talk ourselves into a long-term recession in the US. I certainly think there's a real risk that we see such a fall in investment that it becomes self-perpetuating into a longer and deeper recession than is actually needed. And what's probably needed right now is some form of a government program or stimulus program to actually give people confidence and long-run confidence, so that they can co-invest alongside the Crown in some form of growth.
So what do you think about the argument that Chris Bishop would make, and maybe Nicola Willis, and maybe they will make it on May the 30th, that the government itself can't afford to use its capital to invest in water infrastructure or roading or rail or whatever, and that we can solve this problem with public-private partnerships? We can get private capital involved here. The private sector always does it better than the public sector, and we can keep interest rates and government debt low by doing this. Is that possible?
It's possible, but it's highly unlikely, is the honest answer. I live in a city just to the north of here. We have Transmission Gully, which is swallowing up ever larger amounts of the transport budget, just in terms of the costs. The only reason the lights are on is because of a series of decisions to invest in hydro dams in the 1970s. During the last 10 years, we've had exactly 0 net new generation in New Zealand. At the same time, as populations increased significantly and private sector firms have reaped billions of dollars of profits during that period of time. It's possible, but it's highly unlikely. And New Zealand's experience with private finance initiatives, New Zealand's experience with PPPs, is that they're just very expensive ways to keep debt off the books of central government.
And it was really interesting to see in the briefing to the incoming minister from Crown Fibre Holdings, which is seen as the shining hope for PPPs, and was used by John Key's and Bill English's government to roll out the fibre network, which most people would think is a success. this would be the model, and it is being used as the basis for a lot of the negotiations for these public-private partnerships. Even it said in its briefing to the incoming minister that less than 10% of the capital needed to deal with our infrastructure deficit would be able to come from these public-private partnerships, simply because they are quite expensive. Not only have you got a whole bunch of fees and consultants in there, but you have to pay a higher interest rate effectively on the debt that's raised. And every time you pay a higher interest rate, that means the threshold for choosing to invest or not invest is much higher in terms of returns. Therefore, that reduces just by its nature the amount of projects that you can do. And also, they really depend a lot on some sort of new revenue source, congestion charges, new water charges, those sorts of things. I wonder, Craig, whether the government politically understands the difficulties of, putting new congestion charges on roads. We've seen in the last couple of weeks, Infrastructure New Zealand propose that every vehicle in the country be chipped, effectively, have a device which can then measure not only how heavy you are, how big you are, but the roads that you drive on, so you can get be charged a fair amount. You've been around in the public sector in Wellington a while now, looking at these debates around demand management and user pays and that sort of thing. What's your feeling about, how this might fly if the government does come out on May 30th and says, right, we're going to do PPPs and there's going to be a lot of congestion charges, guys. Download this app and make sure you leave it in the car. How's that going to play out?
I mean, I worked for a government that tried to vaccinate the country against the pandemic. And it was claimed that we were tramping over civil liberties and we were stopping people from leading lives of freedom. Can you imagine putting a chip in everyone's car and being able to follow their vehicle at all times? It would be very difficult to enforce. It would be very difficult to do. How do you do the charging? Do you do dynamic charging? How do you make sure that you're not delivering charging that actually is highly regressive, so that if you're poor and you need to travel around for work, you're not actively disincentivizing work? How do you make sure that you're actually working in ways that actually that the public has confidence that the revenue generated from one source ends up in the other place? Because it just looks like another tax. It just looks like another means of making money. So there's a whole heap, and that's before you get to the technological and other barriers that are then faced in the country. It's really hard to do. The thing that we should note here is actually the finance is not the problem. Money is not the problem. It's the ability to build the things that we need that really is the problem in New Zealand. The ability to actually deliver the infrastructure is the real problem. We don't have the skills, we don't have the people, we don't have the equipment. Those are the things we really need to address, not the fact the money is there. We can borrow the money or we can find the money. That's really straightforward. The actual problem is the ability to do and the ability to execute. And that's the thing that's holding us back as a country.
Craig, I think we can see the state of the economy that even somebody like you has been forced to go and live in their car on the mean streets of Berempore. I'm here in London, and we've just, it's a slightly different thing from public partnerships, although of course the UK legacy of public-private partnerships is disastrous.
Yes.
One of I actually know quite a lot of this. The person I'm staying with used to run quite a few of them, and ended up owning schools and hospitals and lights for councils and that kind of thing. It's a long-term fiscal disaster rather than just bringing down or containing the public sector borrowing requirement. And I wonder, why aren't we learning these lessons? I mean, then there's the privatisation thing. Thames Water, $15 billion in debt since it was taken over by Macquarie and everybody, and all of those were extracted in dividends, and now it's about to be renationalised. We seem on the right wing, and I understand, as Bernard said before, the private sector always does it better kind of arguments, but we seem unable to New Zealand to innovate on ideas rather than bring hackneyed, half-assed ideas that have already failed in the UK and the US.
Oh, it's not that New Zealand is special in that country, or many advanced countries around the world are lured by the idea of free money. Somebody else's money is going to pay for the things that we want today, and they can deliver it better than us. And the thing about free money is that it spends so much more easily than our money. And so we can deliver, roads, rails, schools, hospitals with somebody else's cash. And 30 years from now, future us is going to pay for it. And future us is more handsome and capable than current us. And so that's the real challenge. We have a $200 billion infrastructure gap in New Zealand, not because we want an infrastructure gap, but because we've constantly kicked the can down the road in the hope that the future will pay for things. And PPPs and PFIs are just another means of kicking the can down the road and hoping that somebody pays for something.
Just finally, Craig, on a political economy front, you're in an unusual position in that you've worked as an economist in the public sector, but also worked as an economist in the previous finance minister's office. So you're right at the junction point between politics and policy. And without betraying, any of the decisions or any of the information that you were privy to in your previous role, tell us about, how the politicians react or how they feel when they suddenly see 3 polls showing that support for them has collapsed inside 5 months, the fastest fall in support for a brand new government in MMP history. How might that actually change the way the government's doing things? We've already seen Chris Bishop come out and say, we're going to listen to these people who are saying that the fast track approvals bill is just a bit over the top. We'll see. But do you think the government might look at these polls and go, guys, I think we overreached here. We're doing a bit too much of the crashing rather than the crashing through?
The very best politicians, the very best politicians that I work with, like Jacinda or Grant, tend to look through that noise and tend to say, we have an agenda, we're gonna look at this, we're gonna deliver what we've said, we'll course correct later on, but we will, there are some fundamental tenets. Our politics are this, and that is what we're going to deliver to. It tends to be politicians who are a bit weaker who then tend to go, I'm gonna respond. I'm gonna be macho about this. I'm gonna be hard, or I'm gonna be very difficult. Nothing says weakness than pretending to be hard, pretending to be tough.
Oh, you're a philosopher.
That is what
Craig.
I fear, and that is what I fear is actually about to happen. Is we're about to pretend to be tough. We're about to say, we're gonna stop doing this, or we're gonna crack down hard on beneficiaries, or we're gonna crack down hard on crime in some kind of attempt to throw a distraction on the table. Famously, the Crosby-Textor approach is just to chuck a dead cat on the table and hope that you change the conversation. And that's where I fear we're heading, is that actually we'll end up with something at the budget where there's someone throws a dead cat on the table at the budget in the hope that we're talking about that and not the problems of the government today.
And you've been talking to other Scottish political advisors. I think The Thick of It was one of those great shows which captured the mood. I think one of his it must be several episodes which cover this sort of thing.
Yeah, there's a very famous phrase, a very famous section of that particular show, where a political advisor was asked the question, so you need a policy that's instantly doable, costs you nothing, and is 100% popular. And he says, yes. And he says, public hanging. Bring back public hanging. And that's you've got to look through these short-term changes in politics, and because if you genuinely believe in what you believe, you've got to then see that through, and you've got to actually deliver that. And so the budget will be a real test of the mettle of this government and the ability of National, as the main party of this government, to actually see its agenda through. Because if it can't, it spells real problems over the next 12 months.
Craig, thank you very much for zooming
Thanks
in,
very much,
so to
Craig.
speak, from the busy Wellington and slightly fearful Wellington at the moment. Lovely to see you again and talk to you again. Peter, just to finish off tonight, you and some colleagues have been busy at Koi2, the Auckland University think tanky thing that's connected with Peter Gluckman. Can you tell us about the report?
Yeah, a little bit. So contributed a small amount to it, but Dr. Gavin Ellis, the former editor of the Herald and a now noted media academic, really convened this at Sir Peter Gluckman's request, and it had input from a range of experts. Essentially, the entire New Zealand media industry contributed to it, which has been valuable, along with civil society people, legal people, and some technology and policy people. And it's come up with a set of recommendations. Really, what it's intended to do is go onto the office of Melissa Lee and encourage her to think in particular ways or to see it holistically. Of course, that will now go to Paul Goldsmith. It's an interesting report. It canvasses the situations about media regulation, the business model, big tech. It's quite a broad brush approach, or at least it spans all of the issues involving media. And if I think about the key recommendations that come out of it, I'm kind of pleased that one of that Gavin has put at the very top, that news media itself needs to urgently review its own practices to rebuild trust and news avoidance. So there's a sort of taking of responsibility in there that I rather like. It also proposes that the Digital Services Tax Bill incorporates a levy to compensate media for direct and indirect use of content. I think that is an interesting issue. It's been debated around whether those companies would stay in the New Zealand market if that were imposed. I don't know. But there's also some other areas of the business model, getting rid of the costs of linear broadcasting through Cordia, the publicly owned bandwidth provider. And also re-looking at regulation so that the Broadcasting Commission be reconstituted to something much more like Ofcom in the UK, so that it spans digital technology and media. It also calls for an expanded role really for NZ On Air and Te Mangai Paho, which is sort of a Maori equivalent in a way, or a Te Ao Maori equivalent, which is that might be the vehicle for any distribution of levies that were taken for to support media. So it's a really, I would encourage people to take a look at it if they want. It's a very comprehensive report. It's probably one of the better pieces of work that's been done in this area, certainly in New Zealand. And it's also one of my favourite recommendations, which I think is the last one before I get on to the skateboarding dog, Bernard, is both tax relief for eligible media outlets, but also the promotion of philanthropic funding for journalism, which is something I've had a lot to do with overseas, and I think is a really interesting model where you get, as long as it's transparent, of course, where you get investigative journalism, for example, or local journalism funded by local or national philanthropy groups. But the transparency there is critical, and we have to avoid it repeating the political weaponization of the Public Interest Journalism Fund, rather.
And just finally, to help build trust in media, we have a skateboarding dog, Peter.
We do. Now, rather nicely, and we should have probably attached it to Craig Rennie's thing, Veep, along with the thick of it, was also written by Armando Iannucci. And this week we've had some remarks published in a book by the Veep candidate, the potential next Trump vice presidential candidate, who looks to have completely stuffed her own candidacy by recalling that she'd shot her dog called Cricket, a 14-month-old wide-haired pointer, because the dog was useless at hunting and a danger to chickens. She then also revealed that she'd taken 2 shotgun blasts to a goat. So all of this is to make her seem even more ridiculous than Dreyfus in Veep.
That's a political slogan.
Oh, that's right. It was also that and you better get the person you live with to think about this, that the goat was an unnamed, uncastrated male, which she deemed too smelly and unruly. So I'd watch yourself at home tonight. There's going to be a lot of ideas around.
That's a political slogan I wasn't expecting. Tough on goats and tough on the causes of goats.
Yeah.
Great. Peter, thank you very much. Sadly, we didn't see any foxes today.
I'm really sorry about the fox situation, Bernard. I think they're sitting inside smoking a breakfast cigarette and having a cup of coffee.
On that mental note, mental image, I shall leave you and talk again next week. That has been the Hoon. I've
Talk
been
soon. And thank
Bernard
you,
Hickey
everybody.
and Peter Bale. We say thank you very much. Ngā mihi nui, mā te wā.